Welcome to What's the Point? A weekly discussion of truth, realities, challenges, theological and philosophical views, national policies, and international concerns.
Welcome to What's the Point? Today we're going to be talking about the second half of Paul, which is really going to be a deep dive on Paul's ministry. So if we want to do just a really quick recap of Paul so that people who haven't seen the first episode can kind of get an idea. So just like quickly, who is Paul? Dad, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so Paul, he was originally Saul, and he was a leading member of the religious council of those days. And he had a passion to really wipe out, in fact, kill, is the right word, the followers of Jesus. So he was persecuting left and right. And it has become his mission to do that. And on his way to Damascus to do terrible persecution there, that was when he met the Lord. That was when God literally blinded him, and he was blind. So with all his powers and authority, he had nothing he can do. He was blinded. And then God used Ananias to minister to him, and he was sort of discipled. He regained his sight, and he was taught a bit. And then from a murderer, he turned into a missionary and writer, for that matter. And so then he started all the, in my recollection, I think Paul did 3 missionary journeys, 3 sort of missionary trips every time. The church before really was Jerusalem. That was the sort of mother church. And Paul started not from Jerusalem, from another place. And then he had to report to Jerusalem and then go on a missionary trip, like 3 missionary trips, planting churches all the time along the way. And using his profession as well, partly, and in fact, in most of the time to support his trips, more than supported by other people. So that's more like, and if you look at the Bible, about half of the Bible, God used Paul to write it.
Right.
Wow.
That's good.
Yeah. What do you think, Josh? What do you give us some insight on Paul?
I think for me, like Dad was saying, Paul was this kind of enemy against Christians at the start, but it's really cool to see the aspect of, again, the narrative of God can use anybody, and him being able to, write the majority of our New Testament today, right? And that's, still been impactful over numerous lives of Christians, even today's standard. It's really cool to see, like, that, maybe somebody in their life have felt like they're enemy of God for a long time, right? I mean, that doesn't mean that disqualifies you at all. It just means that maybe it took you longer to understand, or the main thing there that really Paul understood was this aspect that's very beautiful, and he used his advantage, actually. And I think for those who are really lost and really want to come to the Lord, you can use that advantage as well. It's the aspect of using, this idea of who sins much loves much, and who doesn't sin much doesn't love much. More emphasis on the first part. The emphasis there is the aspect of, like, when you understand how deep your sin is, right, then you begin to love God way more, because then everything feels like a gift from there, because you feel like, hey, I don't, you know what I'm saying, I never deserve that. Whereas somebody who, let's just say, that they've maybe not sinned as much, they maybe like have stayed the right path for a while, they may feel the opposite pressure of, like, man, like, I don't want to mess up, like, because deep down they're thinking part of about this salvation is on me, so, like, that's the main thing to understand there, is if you're really lost, use your brokenness to your advantage of saying, hey, look, I'm able to love God way more because I understand that I don't deserve any of this. Everything becomes much sweeter. So I think Paul used that to his advantage of really selling out for the gospel, because he understood that he was on borrowed time, really, as
Wow.
far as everything, So that's the main thing, is that, for those people who feel like they're as Paul, just love as much as you can with the time left that you have, right? Because then, like, it really soak in the aspect that you're forgiven, you're saved. And so, like, that alone will help you, propel you to work harder than trying to, like, on the opposite side, say, I don't want to mess up, because, like, it's almost like this counterbalance of, like, I don't want to be those people, or like whatever, but which in turn, like, actually doesn't help them a lot, because it doesn't make them love God more.
Because they don't really
So
realize how far, like, where they've been taken from. If I guess you haven't, it's kind of like when someone hits rock bottom, they appreciate being out of that more than someone who's just been
right.
fine.
Or an example would be, like, let's just say, like, and it's just kind of an extreme example, but somebody who has cancer, let's say at an early age, right? They're in turn more willing to, like, think of every day as a gift, as opposed to somebody who, doesn't have cancer all their life. So, like, later on, right? Because like, the person that has cancer early on, if they live the same time, that life lived probably is much sweeter, because they understand that each day is not given.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of that's not all the time that, the whole case, but that's kind of how it is, as far as, like, those who sin a lot at the beginning as well. Like, they, like, once found Jesus' grace, they really, like, go full sin, because you see a lot of drug dealers, or a lot of, like, people who done bad stuff become pastors, because of that very reason. Of, they know everything is borrowed time. So then there's no, like, ulterior motive of, like, your righteousness, because everything else there is kind of a gift. So, and that's the main point.
Yeah, no, that's good. So really, you guys talked about him writing majority of the New Testament. Is that what he's famous for? And really, if this is more of a deep dive in his ministry as well. So let's talk about the ministry. After last week, or I guess last episode, we talked that he was mentored for about 3 years before he actually went on his ministry. So what did he do during these 3 years, and how was his ministry after, like, when he actually started doing it?
Yeah. You were asking about what Paul was famous for.
Yeah. What was he famous for?
At the outset, it looks like he is really famous for his writings, because we refer to him all the time from the book of Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Thessalonians. Most of these Pauline epistles were attributed to him, although some contest that some were not written by him, but generally he was involved in that. And at the outset, to many, that's what he's most famous for. But I would like to look at differently. I think I would like to look at him more famous as a missionary and church planter, because at the time there was only one church, that was Jerusalem, and he started doing his missionary trips and establishing churches in many places. And if you look at history, these churches became big churches, sending missionaries also around the world until the whole world was evangelized. So even I would believe when you trace the church in the Philippines, it would eventually go back to one of the churches that Paul established. And so if Paul did not follow God in establishing churches other than the church in Jerusalem, of course God can use other people, the whole world would not have been evangelized. And the concept of a replicable missions work, meaning okay, I started church, you do this, and then you start another church. Then it never ends, and it goes into territories that were never reached until the whole world will eventually be reached. So I would like to for me, I would like to make Paul more famous for being a missionary rather than a writer.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think, Josh? Just on the question of what was he famous for?
That's a great insight that Dad said, right? The aspect of like, as a missions person, like going out. Because like, I mean, if you really look at Paul, like his mission was to the Gentiles, right? Which meant that his missions were to the people who were non-Jews, right? And so like, that's pretty much the entire world besides, Jewish people at the time. So like for him, that was a massive thing because like by him church planting. And I think the cool thing about Paul too is that like diligent, because a lot of times people have to understand context. So a lot of times when he was writing to these churches, he was in prison, right?
Oh, yeah.
So like, and I've heard this thing too. Like I remember like, because we're studying right now, like medieval period, like Christians and stuff. A lot of people actually get inspired by Paul, right? Because when they're reading the Bible, right, they're reading the context behind Paul, right? And why is he so enthusiastic? But when you see where he was when he wrote it, he was in prison. So a lot of people in the medieval times really like resonated with Paul, because of this aspect of like, hey, like, look, if Paul was doing this, Luther, when I'm in prison.
Yeah, that's
you
true.
See what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, which is pretty. So if not for Paul's inspiration, unbeknownst to him, of where he was at when he made these things, like people would not have been inspired to do the same thing, right? That's why a lot of the translations that we have now came from the inspiration of doing stuff in prison from Paul, right?
Yeah, that's
like,
big because
you don't get inspiration from David, because David was never in prison. I mean, he was running away from Saul, but that's not prison, right? Whereas like other stuff, like, in the Bible, Moses wasn't really in prison. I know it was wilderness and stuff, but like, for people like modern day people, they can resonate with Paul because like he brought the standard of not being lazy while in prison. Because like, if you're thinking about it, when you're in prison, like you have the right almost to be lazy, because you're in survival mode. You're saying I can't concentrate, right? A lot of times people can't write not in prison, but now it's like exponentially harder to write in prison because there's so many distractions. Also, that can relate. Like, a lot of times you're not certain in your mind where you're gonna go. You can maybe executed, right? Or like you can like you can be moved to a different place or be stabbed, or whatever it is. But I think it was Paul's inspiration. So Dad was gonna say a lot of missions aspect. I think it was Paul's inspiration. Not because he's known for obviously the writings that he's known for, like, mission and stuff. But I want to emphasize like maybe he's known for like his character as well, like post obviously Saul, and how diligent and encouraging he was in his situation. You know what I'm saying? Not just like, because like he wasn't comfortable when he was writing those stuff, but he continued to write to the church all the time, even though he didn't know if he was going to die the next day.
Yeah, because he didn't want that his last time, because even though he was in prison, he was like maximizing his time there. Basically, the next one I had is, just Paul's ministry. You guys are talking more in depth about his. What were his strengths and how did he deal with his weaknesses?
There are a lot of how do you call that? A lot of speculations on what Paul meant by thorn in the flesh, and probably that's his main weakness, whatever that is. A lot of speculations, but Paul recognizes in many instances that he was not perfect, that he had weaknesses. In fact, he is made stronger by trusting in God's grace to overcome his weaknesses. But one thing I know is that Paul had a problem with his eyes. I read somewhere that maybe in today's time, maybe he had grade 800 or so, and there was no way to operate on that. But he had a problem with his eyes, and so he would have a problem reading and writing. And despite his eye problem, he was a prolific writer and of course reader at the time. So he was using his weakness even to do greater things, like what Josh was saying. He was in prison, but still wrote letters to
Wow,
people.
yeah.
They were also saying that Paul was not as good looking as the other common people of those days, but he was charismatic ministerially. He was influential. So in today's world, you need to be sort of good looking like an actor to be like influential. But Paul was not that, and yet he had created a lot of influence. So I know he was, I don't know exactly what the thorn in the flesh was, but others are saying it could be a sin that he's struggling with. It could be a sickness that he's struggling with. But he was not perfect. He was a guy who recognizes that even towards the end of his ministry, the thing that he wanted to do, he cannot actually do. And those that he did not want to do, he found himself doing. So he was even struggling until the end of his ministry, and he recognizes that. But people are humble enough to accept that they're weak,
Yeah.
instead of those people who are proud to think.
Right.
So Paul demonstrated that. And again, as Josh was saying, that you get a lot of inspiration from someone who is more like you than someone who is not like you. You say, well, I cannot do that. He started from a rich family. He's so good. He's that. So that's not me. But Paul is very much the ordinary person that anyone can associate or relate with.
Yeah.
So,
Right. I think for me,
that I believe.
right, I think for me, what's fascinating is like for Paul, like, when you look at like kind of his whole life, right, it's ups and downs and stuff. But it's fascinating that like when it comes to his weaknesses of Paul, right? Like we don't know what that thorn is, but that thorn must be agonizing, right? Because he asked God to take it away 3 times, right? But God doesn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's like necessarily a thorn that's just like kind of an important thorn, because like you ask God to take it away, maybe even that 3 times is just when I guess like in scripture, but like in reality, like maybe it's like 3,000 times or whatever. Like I think it's just like what do you call it, like a number thing where it's like he asked 3 times, maybe he did, but like
Maybe, yeah, but
3 is the number of completion. So
but maybe
so
he asked like
he
more
asked,
than
like,
that.
right, but regardless, like and obviously God heard him, but God didn't allow it to happen because obviously like in his weakness, God's strength is made known. All that to say, the thorn had to be agonizing. It wasn't just like this, like kind of like the thorn was really bothering him. And all that to say, like everybody has a thorn that's bothering them in this life. See that with a lot of different things. So it could be for one person it's physical, or for another person anxiety. For some reason, like they feel depressed or whatever it is, like that kind of evens the playing field. It's really fascinating how like one person could be extremely healthy physically, right? But then struggles insane amounts of depression or insane amounts of anxiety, right? Another person who is not struggling at all or spiritual health, but they're thrown a lot of physical struggles.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
so you don't really know, like you,
so like,
don't. It, like you said, the thorn evens it out.
This is good. So everybody has a thorn, right? So like, this mentality of like kind of evens playing field, it makes Paul relatable because that thorn is there throughout his whole life. So now I think about it, like, and what Paul really says, like before, I'm thinking about the humbleness aspect of it as well, right? Paul was humble, towards the end of his life. And for a long time I'm in sports, so I think about it And some, coaches have taught me like that sometimes being humble is not like, maybe the best thing, or like not the most effective thing, because like, I guess like you need some fire to pump you up or whatever. But as I'm getting older, I understand that the idea of being humble, like even in sports or whatever it is in life, is really important, because like it's what Jesus did. So not that like, because sometimes you can, the truth is sometimes being humble isn't effective, like in the surface, because you may not like woo people the way like a cocky person would, or like you may not like whatever, the extra sell tickets because you're not cocky or whatever, like
Yeah.
But like when it comes to being a disciple, you have to be humble, because Jesus was humble. So like you're not greater than your master. So if you call Jesus your master, no matter who you are, you have to be humble. Something I'm realizing now is like, what's the point of even being humble? Because for a while I was thinking about like, it's something that my parents taught me, whatever, but like what's the true point of being humble? And it's just simply becoming like Jesus, right? And so that's my main thing. I'm like, oh wow, okay, like you just be humble because you want to be like your master, not because of like it's cool. Because sometimes being humble is cool, right? You see, oh, I'm not gonna talk. Thank you. But that's more like self-righteous sometimes, because you can get it mixed up.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But then like if you really think about why, right? You want to think about whys, though. I want to be humble because it's what society is doing right now, because that can change.
Yeah.
So what I'm realizing right now is like, find out the whys so that when push comes to shove, it won't change. Because then if how society anymore, then like, it's more overconfidence, and like, so that's one another thing. So that's the weakness aspect of it. The strength aspect that Paul had was zeal. It's something that he had all his life. What zeal means is this fervor and this like passionate thing for Christ. Passionate thing in general for what he loved to do. So like some people, you see this a lot with some people, they're very passionate in what they do. That's how I am. But like if you look at Paul, he was kind of impulsive as well. So like, but God saw potential in that impulsiveness. So then like God eventually channeled the impulsiveness the right way.
Yeah.
So a lot of people might be listening to this and they might feel impulsive of like, hey, like I'm a type of person that I'm very giving to people, right? But also at the same time, I'm very like, I can't hold my tongue, or like I'm very impulsive in whatever it is.
Yeah.
So then like, instead of omitting the impulsiveness completely, ask God to change it around for you where you can turn it into the benefit. Because then by you being impulsive, it actually makes it easier for you to follow God's next step.
Yeah, if you look at Paul as well, right?
Some people are like, they're impulsive, whereas other people, they're too calculated. So you find that balance, because when you're impulsive, it can work to your favor, because you say, okay, I will do this next one, God. I will do this next one. Whereas a more calculated person, they're not as impulsive, so they're not gonna just jump. When God says it.
Exactly.
They
think
so
more,
like,
they kind of like think ahead, or like, oh, well, what about this? What if this doesn't work out? What if they don't listen?
And they go, it doesn't make sense, God, so I won't follow you.
Yeah.
Impulsive. But then obviously the downside of being impulsive is like sometimes it can get you in trouble. You see that with Peter, right? Like cutting off somebody's ear, or like saying stuff you don't want to say, fighting, right? But like even God used impulsiveness as later on a strength.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's like really that becomes Paul's strength later on. Obviously to his defense of the faith as well. He really defended the faith very well, of like, but also did it in love. Because a lot of people try to copy that aspect of Paul, but it's one-sided. So they copy the aspect of Paul defending the faith, but they don't match it up with a love of God, that, is shown through grace and shown through praying for others, right? So that's the balance that Paul really had a good time in, is like, you know what I mean? Like that. He understood the grace and love aspect of it too.
Yeah, so as I'm saying, I agree. Paul actually was consistent. He was very passionate in persecuting Christians when he was still not a believer of Christ, but he was equally passionate at proclaiming the gospel to non-Christians when he consistent person who he was before, but for another
Right.
cause, was the same consistent passion he
Right.
had
And
for
before
the gospel.
I will say really quickly, and I want to encourage people today. That's the same thing for a lot of people. You see in the Philippines or all over the world, whoever's watching, is that you see a lot of people that are passionate about things. You're seeing your Facebook. If you're posting more than 3 times a day on Facebook, you're passionate about something,
Yeah.
right? But what God is trying to say is just channel that passion for me, right? I would say a lot of people, a lot of Filipinos, a lot of people are very passionate, but God is just saying, if you take the time to be passionate about me, then you can be a world changer.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
No, that's
Yeah, as I've said, as I've said, Paul was consistent, and the other one, he was very committed to his cause and his purpose. He knew what God was calling him for, and he was committed to that, come what may. Whether in prison, whether traveling, whether shipwrecked, whether in whatever form, it does not stop him from doing it. So that's, to me, commitment.
right.
But the other thing in Paul was he did not stop to be competent. He he was discipled, but he keeps on teaching people too. Everywhere he goes, he writes, he tells them what to do. So he has this drive for competence. And he was a good communicator, by the way. So he has
Right.
communication
If you look at-
skills. But all those letter C's I was mentioning is really grounded on the major C, which is really character.
ooh.
So he was really a man of
So
character,
that's why
and that will translate in commitment, in consistency, in
that's why I
communication.
feel like I wish God named me Paul as well, because there's power of names, right? But I'm not named Paul, and I blame God for that. The reason why is because Paul, if you look at the Bible, not once was he mentioned about being lazy or incompetent. He was never, right? That wasn't
No,
part
that
of his
was
DNA.
never something that they brought up.
Right.
Yeah.
But the issue is, my name is David, right? And so, like, David at a point in his life was a little bit lazy as well, a little bit incompetent, right? So that's kind of where, like, that disconnect happened. But Joshua was consistent, so that's kind of balanced.
Joshua
Yeah,
was
well, if you were
consistent,
named-
and so you
Josh,
have to be
if-
named
yeah.
evenly, you know?
But see,
but
the
if you were
issue is-
named, now, Josh, if you were named Paul, you would not have an AB.
Why?
Yeah, because then Paul, one thing in Paul's life, there was no mention of like a woman he was related
But
to.
he was
So
married,
he
right?
would not have.
Like,
He
at one point,
was
at least,
married,
because
but
that was
we had
a
established that he
Pharisee.
was either married or was married, but
Anyway, but
Yeah.
I will say too, like, the thing with that is I feel like I'm less consistent because they only name me Josh and there's no Ua, so like it doesn't complete the consistency.
Yeah,
So,
that's a nickname of
That's why
Joshua.
that's mom's fault for wanting 13, right?
I know we could have if 15 was fine, Joshua would have been good, right?
But 30, you have to be 30. So
Yeah.
but like, you know,
Well,
right.
but I was glad. I was really glad you had an AB, not a Bathsheba.
Right, exactly. Right, exactly. That's true. No, but it's right. It's really cool to see, like, real quick, Paul, the aspect of like just the discipleship too. Like, we have to understand, like, a lot of times people get in trouble, not only in the Bible, but in real life. You know how they get in trouble because, and I'm learning this through like church history as well. Kings go crazy because something about them does not want to give up power.
Yeah.
So they don't prep ahead. They don't relinquish their power. It's really fast in history, maybe even for, you know, like, who's gonna, like, I'm gonna relinquish power one day, who's gonna get after me, right?
Yeah, they're so worried about
with
that.
Saul, like something about them, like in the Old Testament, or like a lot of different kings in real life as well, like in contemporary society, you know, they accept them getting old, or they're not willing to accept them, having to give birth, then that's how they go crazy, or that's how they lose their whole empire, or that's how they
Yeah,
become
because then
disobedient,
they do
right?
Yeah.
they do
Because
decisions
they
that
don't
are
plan.
sabotaging their current situation.
Exactly. But what's really interesting about Paul is that he was a master at that. He was never afraid to relinquish power, right? And maybe he struggled with it before the conversion moment in Damascus, when he was still a Jewish person, because he was like top of the top. But once he really converted to Christianity and really following God, following Christ, it wasn't a problem for Paul because he was actively seeking. So for those people who are in power, whether you're a CEO or whatever God has put you in power for, be actively seeking who's going to replace you. That way, plan for that early of you're going to get replaced one day. It becomes the bitter pill to swallow becomes actually easier, right? When you take the time to invest in that at an early stage so that you have many more years to accept that.
Well, just to join in that line of thinking, Josh, Paul had no problem relinquishing power. In fact, he was empowering people to be like him. But Paul would really react very badly when his reputation or testimony is being questioned.
That's fair.
He will defend it. He will defend it. So he doesn't mind losing the power, but he will defend his character from being damaged or misinterpreted. But Paul was very, how do you call that? He was very circumspect, I think is the right word, or very careful with the way in the handling of his finances. And that was the reason why he does not want to be supported by any to support his missions work primarily in a business. So he used his business to expect of Paul. He was not a missionary that was sent by a missionary organization. He was not supported by the Jerusalem church with some honorarium on salary. He was supporting it on his own, but he was raising funds along the way to help churches. So he was a good fundraiser too. And people. So that
I
is
think
one
he's
aspect.
doing that because you just mentioned that he doesn't want his testimony and his character to be changed. I mean, for someone to misinterpret it. Maybe he's thinking that he really had to make sure he was self-sufficient in the ministry so that it wouldn't, because everybody knows of his past. Everybody knows who he is before he was converted. So not asking for money probably from the church, or not accepting it, whatever, is also to show that I am not doing this for like money purposes. I'm really doing it for God.
The balance there, because if you look at Paul, he's very quick to say his weaknesses. So I don't even think it's his character maybe that he's trying to defend. I think he's simply defending that, hey, like, believe in my teaching because it's the right thing. Because oftentimes he'll like explain his like weaknesses so quick to defend himself when people say that the gospel you're preaching is in vain or the gospel you're preaching is not correct. That's when he really gets offended. But when somebody maybe will attack character, as I'm reading the Bible, like it's like he's more like passive on that. But when it really comes to somebody not preaching the right gospel, even Jesus' disciple, he will chew out like Peter. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's something I've realized is that when it comes to just the main gospel, because I remember him even tottering of saying, hey, like, I went to these different places to get discipled because I want to make sure that when I'm running this race, I'm not running it in vain. So even that he was a little bit uncertain in those kind of like early years of his thing. But I think what he gets really defensive about is when people say the gospel you're saying is not correct. That's when he loses his mind and just like, really has to defend it as hard as he can.
Yeah. And when Josh was talking about leadership succession, Paul had no problem with that.
Exactly.
Because he was actually, in fact, building leaders left and right.
Right.
He was training them. That was his passion, one of his passions, was really to
Right.
keep on training people to continue the ministry.
Like he wasn't threatened that he wasn't going to be the star one day. You know what I mean? Like he
No,
wasn't threatened.
he never wanted to be the star.
Because like at the end of the day, like at that time, like Paul and Peter were the stars. They were the two main stars.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
they didn't want to be
I
stars,
mean,
but they were the stars.
Right now, what at the time, like right now, we're thinking about it. Yes, they were the stars as we read the Bible.
Right, exactly. But he had no problem. Like 'cause a lot of people, when they're stars like that, I mean, it gets to them, right? But like for them two, they had no problem. Like you know, I guess it comes with Jesus as well. But they had no problem like saying, "Hey, like I'm okay when I'm not star anymore. That's why I'm gonna disciple." It's the same thing of like as an NBA player. A lot of the times, you instead of like being a veteran, like because you're a star, and then once you're starting to slow down, like 37, 38, instead of like being good to your teammates, you're more hostile or like or you're trying to protect your legacy or whatever. Instead of
Right.
like
So you want to make sure
them,
like that you look good on the last couple games. That's gonna
or
be
you want to
remembered.
make like you score as much as you can before you retire,
Yeah.
opposed to like helping them out, helping the younger people out.
Exactly.
So like that's the two basic thoughts of like, you know, which one are you gonna be, like which NBA veteran are you gonna be? Like obviously you're gonna be a Hall of Famer, let's just say, but like how are you gonna end your like career? Are you gonna end getting as much points as you can, or are you gonna end like by helping these 20-year-olds like help their game, show them the secrets
Exactly.
to
So
how to
that
score
they
so
can
well?
be just as good as you.
So
Really, I have a lot of notes here from what you guys have talked about with Paul. And like we said, you know, he was really more known for, we know him for his writing, but really it's the evangelism aspect. But the last, I guess it would be the last question that I have, and it's going to tie into what's the point? Why are we even talking about Paul? Is, you know, how does someone so messed up like Paul end up writing over half of the New Testament? Why is that? And why, how is that even possible? And then really, what is the point of us talking about it?
Well, yeah, well, the answer, Kerry, is grace. I remembered someone, I read somewhere, somebody wrote an application letter to a church because they were looking for a pastor. And really for a brilliant pastor who can lead the church, and they got an application that says, I am applying for the position. I am an ex-convict. I have been in prison a number of times. I've been shipwrecked. I have been stoned. I'm not good looking. I have problem with my eyes. I cannot really preach that much, but I can write a bit. But one thing I can tell you, I have good character. I'm committed to my task. I'm consistent. I can communicate in ways you probably do not really feel like, but I think I'm competent, and I really believe in God's grace. Paul.
Yeah.
right,
And so
right.
sometimes people look for really bright guys, good-looking guys, nice speaker, really eloquent, but sometimes that's not God's standards. So the answer to your question is grace. God saw what people did not see in Paul, and that was his passion, his spirit, his commitment,
Right.
his and God knew, if I will give this man a task, he will die with it.
Wow.
He will do it.
I will say,
yeah.
right. I will say
Yeah.
there's two things like that maybe qualifiers for God. Number one, God just emphasize this, like, you know, for me, like the idea of if you're not willing to ask the question of, like, I guess, what is it, God, that you want me to do in my life, or what is it that like you want me to do? Like, I guess when you're so caught up with yourself that you're not able to ask that question, right? That's an indicator of like maybe at the time you're not being used by God. But the main thing really there is this second kind of question. So I'm gonna ask you, Carrie, do you know how bishops are appointed? Do you know the main best qualification of a bishop being appointed?
I do not
And this
know.
is with both Catholic and Christian bishops? Do you know?
No, I don't.
What is the most attractive thing that they look for?
No idea.
For a bishop not to want to be a bishop.
Wow.
That is the main thing. That is when they're saying, okay, you're the next bishop. When you actually don't want to be bishop, right?
Right, because they know that the power is already not going to get in your head because you didn't even want it to begin with.
Yeah,
Exactly.
they have always run, Josh. I mean, no kidding. They have always wanted me to be a bishop. In fact, even in the yesterday's meeting, they are now working. They would like me to to work on being a bishop, but I've always not wanted it.
Exactly.
But I have one reason why I did not want it, because I really pity you.
Yeah, I know.
Why? Why that?
Because I don't want you just to be called son of a bitch.
Exactly.
Oh my God, here we go.
Exactly.
Well,
But I'll give you an example real quick. So Dad, like all that jokes aside, the reason why they keep asking for him to be bishop is because they like his quality. It's hard to teach. The quality of I don't want to be a bishop. So a lot of times that's something that's very attractive to God is when you can say, God, I don't want this fame. I don't want these things. I just want you. And that's when it really clicks. I'll give you the world.
yeah, exactly.
You know, and it's like, that's one of the hardest things to do because like, it's like, until you come to that moment, like you won't be fully effective for Christ.
Yeah.
Until you say, I don't want it. Because then like, a lot of times real quick, like when you see like what pleases God, right? Who's exalted in his name, it's those who are readily admitting that because your question is so simple, it's so crazy. Your question is, why would God use a messed up person like Paul? But to God's standard, all sin is the same. So then everybody's messed up.
Yeah.
It's
our standard of messed up. And that was a really good answer really to that question. And it seems simple to us. I mean, it seems like a hard question to us, but it's simple to God because to him, it's like you guys are all messed up. So I'm just picking someone who is fine with not wanting all this fame. So
and kind of like, hey, do you want to be used? And you say, I want to be used, God. And his aspect is like, okay, like then it's the person that says, I want to be used by you because I love you and not because of what you give me or not because of anything else. So like that's what God's looking for.
Well,
exactly.
I just want to add this one. I just saw a video of Billy Graham's funeral, and so the children talk and the wife talked, and the wife said that 5 days after he married Billy Graham, he realized what a messed up man he married to, and he really wanted to leave and he left. And what a messed up man I have married. But his father sort of showed him, this is your chance to love the most unlovable you think. But you know what happened to Billy Graham, the world's greatest evangelist?
Yeah.
But his wife said he was a very messed up
man.
That's great.
But no, that was really good. I'll go ahead and quickly close this in prayer. Thank you, Lord, for this time together that we could talk about Paul. Thank you for just the time that for everything we've learned about him. Thank you for using Paul so that a lot of us now can be inspired by his story. Thank you that he's a great evangelist and that he had always put you first after he was converted. And I pray that we can copy these attributes and learn from Paul, that we should always just want to put you first, to be committed to you. Thank you for this time together. And we pray for anybody that's listening to this podcast that they may be blessed by this message. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.